Good afternoon, Sean.
Afternoon, Bern.
So last week we had a first look at the tragic loss of life for the aid workers from the attack, which now is very clear to have come directly from the IDF. And since then, the Israelis have actually done their own analysis, which has revealed some additional information, some of it a little disturbing.
Yeah, I think what was fascinating for me was that the Israelis didn't comment initially, but then very quickly said they're doing an investigation. They've come out now and admitted, mea culpa, it was our fault. They talked about a tragic mistake. But for me, what's been interesting about how they've come about that is the context. Part of it was because although they admitted it was a mistake, these grey hairs and at least a year in Afghanistan running the dynamic targeting cell, we were doing these sorts of targets. The Israelis had a Hermes 450, in fact, two of these long-range endurance drones that were watching what was going on, tracking these vehicles, and they made the attacks. And it was a series, 3 attacks on 3 vehicles that eventually killed those 6 aid workers and the driver. And although the Israelis sort of dismissed it as a bit of a mistake, when you look at it, humans are inherently going to make mistakes. So a professional military makes sure that you have processes in place, you have rules of engagement, you have standard operating procedures deliberately designed to stop those sorts of mistakes happening. And by way of example, when I was in Afghanistan running the dynamic targeting cell, on my shoulder, I'd always have a legal advisor who was telling me 100 reasons why I couldn't attack a particular target. Occasionally, we had a very high value target. We knew they were there in a relatively remote location, but we didn't know exactly how many people were inside that building. From my perspective, if that bad guy had planned a plot in the UK that was going to kill 10,000 people, I'd never forgive myself for not taking him out in that building. But the law of armed conflict didn't allow you to do that. And therefore, there were a series of hoops you had to follow. And more often than not, you couldn't conduct an attack, even though you wanted to. A fleeting opportunity, you'd be gone. But that's a sign of a professional military.
So what happened here then?
On this particular time, the Israelis admitted there was no legal guy available there, that the information hadn't flowed properly, that the assumption from the drone operator was that the cars were full of Hamas fighters for a whole series of reasons which, with the benefit of hindsight, don't look plausible. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that the Israelis deliberately targeted the aid workers, but there weren't the checks and balances in place. And the worry here is that it's not tragic death of particularly 3 Brits, ex-military guys who were providing the security there. But since the start of the war, 196 aid workers have lost their lives. 196. Tens of thousands of innocent civilians have also lost their lives. The International Court of Justice, when it sat, when the court was South Africa took a case against Israel saying that they were alleging that Israel's actions were in breach of the Genocide Convention. Now, International Court of Justice hasn't ruled on that yet, but what the court did say was Israel needs to do more to protect the civilian population. When things like this happen, and you get an insight into the procedures, the processes, the professionalism of the Israelis, it leaves huge questions unanswered. And that, for me, is the worrying bit here, because with all those aid workers that have died, with all the civilians that have died, how many of those incidents have ever been investigated? The one that was investigated, why? Because it was international aid workers, has exposed these grave failings. How many other of those incidents would have happened were it done more professionally?
Okay, and I guess the best we can say about that is there may be more in it, there may not be. Either way, it's tragic. Families in the UK and other places have lost loved ones. There is absolutely nothing worse. What confuses me about this whole situation, I'm not going on about the fog of war, is this, that we talk about 20, 30,000 innocent civilians have perished. I've heard other analysis on this. The first point is this is Hamas information. It's the only source of information. Well, my instinct would be first not to believe it. The second is, how many terrorists have been killed in that 30,000? I've heard numbers as high as 15,000. But if that's the case, then it's 15,000 innocent civilians. Now, by the way, one is too many. Okay, this is war, but 15,000 is a different number if we're going to use the numbers than 30,000. So I am sitting here actually very confused about the volumetrics. And that worries me, because I know this war, this conflict in Gaza is as much about PR as it is about the actuality on the ground and the progress either side is making. And that troubles me, because we are reacting to the PR, to the information.
I agree with that. One of the challenges is that the Israelis won't allow journalists in, and therefore they control all aspects of the narrative that we're getting out. I think that deeply troubles a lot of people in the reporting of what's going on, because why would you stop journalists going in to actually hear the other side? The one thing I would just temper, though, is we've been reporting the statistics around this conflict since the start, and one of the easy criticisms from the Israelis is that all these figures come from the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Authority, and therefore why would you put any merit behind them? This isn't the first of these sorts of conflicts that have happened, and that same health authority has been providing statistics for each of the previous conflicts. After the event, independent verification of those numbers has demonstrated those numbers are pretty much accurate. So there is a view that says historical precedence is that those numbers are pretty accurate. It may not be comfortable because of the quantum of those numbers, now 33,000 dead, 75,000 injured. What I absolutely do question is what proportion of those are Hamas fighters versus innocent civilians. But having served in war zones, you've got to apply a little bit of common sense to this as well. A lot of the Israeli attacks have been around airstrikes, and they have leveled buildings. If you only have to look at a satellite imagery now of Gaza, there's a lot of leveled buildings. Now, traditionally, inside the buildings will be families. The men folk are out on the ground, either working, scavenging, fighting, or whatever. The women and children are left behind inside the buildings. And it seems entirely credible that the figures allege that about a half to 2/3 of the figures are women and children. Now,
but have you heard the stat? I've heard statistical analysis on this as well. Now, I have done a bit of that, but not enough to get inside the data and challenge it. But there is a lot of additional opinions. Okay, these opinions tend to be a bit binary because they come from one side or the other.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to make sense of it. But there are people saying if you look at the stats and try and work out the ratios between women and children and male and female, etc., you find out it's screwed up all over the place. In other words, there's not the correlation you'd expect. And I particularly because of this podcast, I'm like to feel I'm capable of making some sense of it, but I'm not making sense of it. And I'm just left with this horrible feeling in my gut that I wish these people weren't dying. But as to who's to blame at any given moment, it's a struggle, Sean.
No, and I think all of us are. But I think as we get older, it's not black and white. There's shades of grey out there. Well, we've got the hair envy again. No, it's not black and white. And I do think, one end of the spectrum is you take the figures for face value. The other end of the spectrum, you ignore them completely. What is pretty evident from any external perspective is the devastation that's been wreaked in Gaza. Those buildings coming down, that's where families will have resided. I'd subscribe to the view there's probably a lot of casualties and bodies that they just haven't managed to get out yet. And whatever the actual number, in a way, that's missing the point. The point is that a lot of people have lost their livelihoods, humanitarian crisis, and it's almost certain a lot of people have lost their lives. And a lot of those people are probably not aligned to Hamas. They're probably innocent bystanders,
everyday living folk,
just getting on with their lives.
It's just partly true, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm not going to say but this is war. I'm not interested.
No. And
I don't want people to die.
No, but it goes back to the point of this little segment, was that my worry is if you knew that Israel was conducting a very professional approach to its conduct of war. I've seen counterinsurgencies, I've seen the wars. There are certain processes and procedures that are the DNA of a professional organisation. The odd insight we get, which we did with the aid worker thing, about, and if we had exposed a very, very professional team with all the checks and balance, but it was just one of those things on that night, it was just really unlucky, I might have had a different view. But unfortunately, from the evidence that we've seen, even that the Israelis have offered raises more questions than it does provide answers. And that, I think, has, and it feels like it might have even been so important that it's been a little bit of a turning point in the war, because it's provided President Biden with some powerful ammunition to hold Netanyahu to account.
I think we're going to come on to this, because I think that, from a political point of view, is also quite interesting as to actually what is motivating the political leaders to do or say what they're doing or saying.
Well, and going back to your point about figures, the other thing about this aid workers, it wasn't just that, it was the Al-Shifa hospital, the operation that the Israelis did to clear that. I think it started around the 18th of March and finished on the 1st of April. The Israelis define that as the most successful operation they have done in this conduct of the war. They claim they killed 200 Hamas fighters. They claim they'd found weapons, intelligence, I think $3 million worth of currency as well. But if you look back at it, you go, but they've completely destroyed the biggest hospital in Gaza. That will have profound implications for the health, the humanitarian crisis in the country, and it's impossible to judge what's right or wrong.
And Israel will say, in their coldest moments, they go, yeah, well, don't put your terrorists in front of civilians then and expect to fight a war. You know, if we're going to be criticised by the international criminal courts and held to account, then they need to be held to account as well. You know, look what they're doing. Why isn't Iran been taken to the court? Why isn't Hezbollah been taken to the court? Why aren't Hamas, meant to be the government in Gaza, why aren't they being held to account internationally? They're not. You know, it's complicated, isn't it?
It is, but I do think this was we'll look back at this as a turning point.
I think for a number of reasons, I agree with you. So with the tragic loss of the aid workers after this strike, this seems like a perfect moment for Western leaders to up the ante, including, you know, the biggest of all, President Joe Biden. Why hasn't he been more courageous or forthright in his response to it, Sean?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? From the very start of this conflict, everybody assumed that US was controlling the puppet strings of Netanyahu, and yet this evident anger and frustration from Biden, particularly at what's going on at the moment. So there's quite a lot of calls. For example, several Western nations have decided to stop providing arms to Israel. Why is that? Because the International Court of Justice has said Israel needs to do more to look after civilians. It's actually illegal under international law to provide weapons to a country that you know is using them in violation of international law. And a number of nations have said Israel is clearly not operating sensibly in Gaza. We cannot, therefore, continue to supply weapons. Even in this country, there's been a lot of a debate about it, and there's still a lot of discomfort from some parties. So the question is, why on earth didn't America, who provide most of the weapons, just pull the plug?
Why is that then?
Well, part of it, I think, is America feels responsible for Israel's defense. It is the strategic guarantor of defense. Over the decades since Israel's been formed, America's provided hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons, $3 billion just this year, 2,300 bombs, 25 joint strike fighters. But it is the guarantor.
And you said last time, actually under the wire,
there's a lot
100
more
different shipments.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
But if Biden was to threaten to pull the plug on support, given the historical links, given the Jewish community in America, that would be suicidal political suicide for President Biden
in the coming election,
given this election coming up. So,
and it would cascade throughout the rest of the world.
No, exactly.
Once America decides to do something like that, this is permission for everybody.
Everybody to do that.
And the UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, he's got an election coming up. Actually, quite probably in the same month as America.
Yeah, quite possibly.
So he's got the same set of issues on his table.
But the interesting thing, it puts Biden on the horns of a dilemma because he knows that he has to keep providing weapons, but he absolutely does not want to take America to the wrong side of the law.
Yeah, yeah.
And if he continues to provide weapons, but Netanyahu continues on the path he has, that makes life really difficult
for him. Yeah.
And we've all even had Jill Biden coming up and saying, you've got to call an end to this. Now, I'm not suggesting whether she's powerful or not, but it's unusual to see that. And I think that is why...
choreographed, that sort of comment.
Yeah.
I get it. Okay, so we've seen Netanyahu actually change things. He's opened up aid access, quite quickly. He appears to have withdrawn the troops that were going to really do the final, the end game in Rafah as well. So something's happened to trigger that. There's been conversations, obviously.
I think the disturbing thing about this, we will never know what's going on behind the scenes. But as you say, Netanyahu had his foot on the throat of Hamas, waiting to go into Rafah. The deadline of the end of Ramadan, which is now finished, 9th of April, we're now on the 10th, but hasn't gone in. And actually quite the opposite. He's withdrawn his forces that left a brigade behind, but most of the brigades have left. That would imply that it's going to take a lot longer before he can do the attack into Rafah. There's also allowing aid now into the Ashdod port, which is the Israeli port up to the north, and then potentially through the Erez crossing, which up till now, Netanyahu said it's closed, couldn't possibly be opened. There's a lot of stuff that's changed. And what's been fascinating is there's been some really interesting commentary around this last week that says the reason Netanyahu's doing this is simply to stay in power.
Yeah, well, yeah, awful.
Yeah,
yeah.
As a
he's a politician, isn't he?
Well,
I think because I was just confused then for a second. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's the one thing that's a bit of a line between us here, because as a former military guy, who you have to believe in your politicians, because otherwise you're going to go to war, people are going to die, but you have to believe it's for the right reasons. So when things like this happen, I don't know why Netanyahu's making these calls, but it's pretty evident that once the war is over, his future in politics is over. And there's been a lot of articles talking about this, and I find myself just
it's awful.
It's just awful.
Yeah, I know. I don't know what to make of it. Well, can you imagine this phone call between President Biden and Netanyahu? Hello, Joe. You're a bit upset with me, aren't you? Yeah. Listen, things have got to change. Okay, well, tell you what I'll do. I will open up 2 or 3 more aid routes. I'm going to back off Rafah, and I do a couple of other things. I'm going to institute some new processes to pick up, Sean, the stuff you were talking about earlier. But what I want from you, President Biden, I want the moment I'm overwhelmed with missile attacks from Hezbollah, or Iran actually does what they're threatening to do, then I want you to step in. If you do that for me, I will get you out of this hole and do all those other things for you, which you can claim credit for. So, Sean, if I listen to a tape recording of that, that's the thing I would believe. As you know, I'm a little bit cynical of politicians, and it's all political. That's my concern. And I expect a deal has been done. And we know Israel is in the middle of a conflagration, which is much bigger than this. Its location and its intelligence ability in the middle of the Middle East is a high value place for America. So apart from anything else, they definitely don't want to lose that.
It will be interesting to see whether, because again, one of the ways that this conflict could continue is that Israel's focus moves from Hamas to Hezbollah up in the north, because there are voices within Netanyahu's cabinet that say we've largely dealt with Hamas. Now is the time to deal with Hezbollah, because if we don't deal with them now, when will we get the chance to deal with them? And it'll be really interesting to see what support that has. I look at it from a military perspective, that you have to have a clear idea about what your end state is. And if tackling Hezbollah, is that a symptom or is that a disease? Because if you can tackle a disease and expunge it, you've solved the problem. My understanding of the region, and I'm not claiming to be an expert, but is that the dark shadow of Iran is behind all of this. And simply attacking Hezbollah, with all the implications for Lebanon and instability in the region, is actually going to solve the Hezbollah problem.
I think it's a very valid point, and you know a lot better than me. Obviously, Hezbollah is a bigger, more powerful thing, but possibly a clearer target in that Hamas buried in Gaza is actually quite difficult.
I think the one thing, and we'll get onto it in that later on the show, but the worry for me is that in the absence of having a clear idea about what the political end state is, what's going to happen the day after the war, that has not been talked about. That, for me, is an absolute prerequisite before you go in and conduct a military operation. Because the military operation sets the conditions for success in a political ambition. And it's not clear to me, it's not clear to America. And I suspect some of the frustrations that are flowing from Biden at the moment is going, when you finish fighting, are you continuing to fight because you haven't yet achieved your political objectives? Or are you doing this because you still need to stay in power, and therefore the price that is costing?
That's not good enough. No,
it's not good enough. It's not remotely good enough.
I mean, the Hezbollah thing, I think you raised, which we ought to cover in more depth. We might see on the film the latest attacks from Hezbollah into Israel and the way the Iron Dome responded. It's pretty amazing footage. I wonder whether what Hezbollah were doing, I mean, they probably threw 100 different missiles in. As far as I could see, and I was only looking at the film, they all got shot down. But maybe they were just testing to see what they need to do to actually overwhelm it, going back to a comment you've made many, many weeks ago.
It's worth pointing out, when we see things like that, the Iron Dome system specifically doesn't try to shoot them all down. It predicts which ones are going to hit territory. But as you say, I think from the days of somebody waking up in the morning, a terrorist organisation, let's have a go at something. I think one of the things that has come out from the investigations into the 7th of October attack was that Hamas were joined by 5 different other groups for the attacks on that day, and they were rehearsing since 2020.
In Iran, apparently.
In Iran and in Gaza.
Really? Okay. Yeah.
Since 2020. Yeah, so 3 years.
The military operation.
To plan that. That wasn't on the spur of the moment.
No, definitely not.
So the very fact that Israel didn't manage to pick it up, but they were very, very well prepared, and we'll get onto that.
Yeah. So if it may not be entirely clear how things are actually moving at the moment towards a close or an end, but things are definitely changing. So, and given it's been 6 months, Sean, it's good to just pause for a second and see what's been achieved, and therefore what more has to be achieved before this thing is over between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Have the leaders, and we talk about this a lot, have the leaders actually thought through what the future looks like once this is over?
One of the frustrations, I think, first, I think you're absolutely right. Looking back at it from 6 months, it puts everything in context rather than reacting day to day. Israel seems surprised that on the 7th of October, Hamas attacked. They seemed surprised that over 1,200 people got killed. It sounds like 253 hostages were taken as well. But it wasn't so much that, it was the brutality, the acts of senseless violence, the rape, the burning, the decapitations. It wasn't a military operation. It was way beyond the law of armed conflict and shocked the world. But it is interesting looking back that we now know that Hamas was joined by 5 other militant groups that actually they'd been rehearsing since 2020. So for 3 years. And I suspect that part of the embarrassment of Netanyahu and the Israeli leadership is that 3 years this was all happening. The most sophisticated military organization in the region didn't pick that up at all and therefore got surprised. Regardless, they pretty much instantly declared war on Hamas. When you declare war, it's easy to say that, but war against whom? Was it war against the Palestinian people? No, they claimed it's war against Hamas. But Hamas, they've always described as a terrorist organization. So from military parlance, that would be a counterinsurgency fight, not a war. And it's important because a war makes it difficult to discriminate between civilians and military. That's why the Second World War, First World War, those analogies that Netanyahu's been using to justify these huge casualty figures. Whereas if you're trying to surgically remove Hamas, it's a very, very different operation. But ever since that day, ground invasion, everything that came with that, it's worth the 2 metrics of success for Netanyahu was destroying Hamas and liberating the hostages. That's what he said throughout. 6 months on, have they destroyed Hamas? Well, to all intents and purposes, yes, there's 4 battalions of Hamas fighters left, but will Hamas ever be able to run Gaza again? No. Do they present a credible military threat? Potentially.
That's what you just said. That's the big thing. I've never heard anything so clear as that actually from a governance of Gaza for Hamas, that's the end.
Yeah, and so the negotiations are more about a way of either getting the Hamas leadership gone or Operation Certain Death Starts, where go in. Second one is the hostages. The only time the hostages have been released is during a ceasefire. Far more have been killed during the operation. Still 130 odd that are believed to be held. Probably only 80 that are still alive. But the big picture here, though, is, was it all worth it? They've had 33,000 people killed. Admittedly, we've only got one set of figures. 75,000 injured. You look at the pictures of Gaza, it's absolutely been devastated. Is Israel a safer place as a result of this? What is the world going to look like the day after the conflict? All the conflicts I've been involved in, and when we study them from a military perspective, your political leaders, before you go to war, what does good look like? What is that end state? What do you want politically the answers look like? And the military create the security conditions to enable that to happen. If you don't have an idea of what that end state is, all you're actually doing is retribution. You're retaliating.
9/11 in Afghanistan.
And that's exactly the analogy, where Bush at the time, history would judge that he went in there angry that somebody had attacked American soil, angry that somebody would have the temerity to do that. Let's go out and hurt somebody. And in a way, there's a lot of analysts now saying Netanyahu looks like he's done the same into Gaza. Angry that he was embarrassed, angry that they surprised him, go in and kick the hell out of Gaza. But apart from assuaging his anger, what does it look like? What does the future look like? What does the end state look like? Is it a 2-state solution, which I think the vast majority of the international players believe is the only answer?
Netanyahu doesn't want it.
No.
I mean, in as much as Hamas have any control at all, they don't want it either. So I'd like it if you could find sufficient leadership on both sides to make it happen. But my concern would be with the other proxy capabilities from Iran with Hezbollah and the Houthis and other actors, Islamic State and so on. There's trouble everywhere at the moment. So once you think you've extinguished one fire, another one is burning.
No, and I think what you're explaining is why I think a lot of, in the past, the international community has said it's a bit difficult. It's a Gordian knot of a problem. Put a bit of sticky plaster over it, and by the time it erupts again, I'll have moved on. So it's not my problem.
As a political leader.
Yeah. Whereas on this occasion, if it isn't a two-state solution or one-state solution, where's the money going to come from to rebuild Gaza? Because traditionally it's always been Arab money that's flowed in. It feels to me that the Israelis and the Palestinians are not going to be able to find a solution between the two of them. Too much visceral hatred. So this has to be a concerted international effort. One of the troubles before, when Yasser Arafat was trying to negotiate a peace, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize, but the picture was Yasser Arafat, the Israeli Prime Minister, and Bill Clinton. Powerful picture, but Clinton was an ally of Israel. Yasser Arafat was on his own. It feels like an enduring peace. Yeah, enduring peace has to be mindful of Israel's security, prosperity, and hope. Where's the Palestinian security, prosperity, and hope?
I wish I were an expert, if indeed I believe in experts, but it seems to me like you need good, genuine, morally based leaders on both sides. And dare I say it, I think we're quite short of them at the moment in both territories.
But is it a failure of our form of democracy? I think Churchill famously described democracy as the least worst option.
Yeah.
One of the advantages of the Russian style, the Chinese style, is those leaders are in place for 20 years. I'm not suggesting that's the answer for us, but there are some attributes to having long-term leaders, because if they put a sticky plaster and the wound erupts again, they're responsible for it. So they do put more effort into finding enduring solutions to these sorts of things.
Trudeau was asked many years ago, a comment he probably regrets now, which of the countries in the world he admires most. And he said China. And that's because when you want to get something done, you just do it.
But there is an interesting. It's another for another podcast, I suspect. But in a way, China is looking in the next 10, 20, 30 years. Where do I need the commodities? They've
got the plan,
and they've got a plan for it. Whereas we don't. We muddle along. And
I still think Churchill was right, but yeah, it's a bit of a.
And therefore, for this particular, the bloodshed, this dreadful atrocities, I suspect from both sides, and the truth will eventually come out as to exactly what happened, what the devastation, etc. But if the world is to avoid this happening again, it feels like the world has to be involved in the solution.
That's right. There's got to be, as independent you can possibly be, third parties who are genuinely driven by the need for peace and an enduring life of prosperity for everybody involved, particularly those who will have suffered most from the conflict.
How do you impose that? Because I think there's going to be a degree of imposing on Netanyahu. And
normally at the end of something, you negotiate with power on your side with the loser. It's not quite so obvious in this case.
No.
So, Sean, turning to Ukraine, Zelensky's having trouble getting money and additional support, blockages in America with politics, etc. So he's up the ante, and he said something like, Russia, if you don't come and help me further, Russia is going to swallow Europe, not just Ukraine.
Yeah, it's had a few headlines this week, and of course, when you look at it through the lens of some of the military leaders in this country have been saying, we're walking blind into a third world war. We need to be better prepared. Zelensky, understandably, is trying to up the rhetoric, because if he doesn't get the weapons, things are looking very bleak for him. The only place you can actually get weapons at short notice is America. That's the only stockpiles. $60 billion worth of aid is stored there. So he's decided to up the rhetoric. The trouble is that's a double-edged sword, because if you now turn around and say, right, Germany, right, Poland, right, France, you'll get swallowed up if we don't win. I've just increased my defence budget in Poland to 3.5%. Am I A, going to spend that and give it away to Ukraine, or I'm going to bolster my own defences? And therefore the danger is actually that nations say, actually, you're right, Zelensky.
Counterproductive.
Well,
Possibly.
Now, there are other ways in which the West hasn't yet explored fully supporting Ukraine. We talked about the other week, potentially Macron talked about boots on the ground. It's not about the boots, it's about that would allow much better weapons to be put in. And likewise, no-fly zones. I think that's something that would be incredibly powerful. I accept that that's fraught with risks, but up bluntly, there has to be a debate at some time about at what point is that risk better to take that or not. But that's led to Cameron going out, Lord Cameron going out to America, which you spotted this week, some of the rhetoric around that.
Yeah, and we saw that at the beginning. So Lord Cameron is the UK Defence Secretary. Has been parachuted in from the House of Lords, not an elected member of Parliament. Interestingly enough, he's gone out to shake hands with Donald Trump. And what's going on is he recognising that Trump may well become president, so he's got to cozy up to him. He's eating humble pie. What is Cameron actually trying to achieve by his visit?
I think his remarks are divisive, stupid and wrong, and I think if he came to visit our country, I think it'd unite us all against him.
Obviously, behind closed doors, who knows, but at face value, the $60 billion of aid is being blocked because Trump wants more money to be spent on domestic defence and therefore is blocking it. That's frustrated Biden. So in a way, Lord Cameron's gone out to try to persuade Trump to relent. I'm not entirely sure how, given the rhino skin that Trump seems to have, whether or not, some little Brit politician wobbling over there and asking him to be nice to Ukraine, I don't quite know what difference that's going to make at all. But in a way, you've got to admire the fact that at least somebody's trying to unlock. But do I hold out any hope that that diplomatic visit will suddenly unlock $60 billion worth of aid to Ukraine? I don't.
David Cameron's had something else in his head. And I don't think ever in the history of this man has anybody ever referred to his geographical movements as wombling. But I think appropriate maybe. Yeah. I don't know what he's doing over there. Half of me thinks there's something about him and his future. But as you say, Trump will make up his own mind for good or bad.
I think that for me, the worry here, from again, grand strategic perspective, is that you're now in President Putin's mind. You've got the weapons, you're on the front foot. Ukraine is going to struggle this coming summer because there aren't going to be weapons come unless America relents or unless the West suddenly decides to step in and put boots on the ground or a no-fly zone. So you're going to threaten Armageddon against the West if they even suggest that, because that would be strategic failure. And if I was Putin now, I'd be going, right, I'm going to press on, go as far as I can with my special military operation this summer. When it comes to the winter and I have to draw stumps and pause, there's probably going to be a new president. And at that point, I know Trump will want to look good by negotiating an end to this. Putin will probably run out of steam anyway by then. So what will Putin want? He could well turn around to Trump and say, doors are closed now. This is not public conversation. And I'm happy to call an end to the war. And you're going to look good because you're going to negotiate the end to the war, which nobody else wants. But what I want to do that is I don't want Ukraine to be allowed to join NATO, because that will be a threat on my doorstep. I want all the sanctions that have been put against me to be lifted, and then I'll stop the war. Where is President Zelensky in all that conversation?
A pawn, I would say. If Churchill can lose the election straight after the war, after winning the war, Second World War, for Britain and the world, then Zelensky, who might appear as something of a hero, could easily lose it all. And he'd have to be subject to whatever the terms were. And I mean, the only thing in what you've said, oh, you forgot his wife shopping in Paris, by the way. The only thing that he can take back home from that, really, is the NATO argument. That it needs selling well to his people, but that might seem like a win. But it's not a very big one, is it?
Depends who you look at. I think from Putin, he'd strut around going, it's been absolutely worth it.
Yeah, because this was my thing all along.
I was only ever a
Going
special
way
military
back.
operation. I've now secured Crimea. I've solved the war in the Donbass,
Yeah, okay.
and I've got a land bridge. That's all I ever wanted to do, and I've succeeded.
Okay, Sean, so I vote for you. I think you should go into politics. Yeah, this will be one for you.
I thought you despised politics. I've now
Well, I despise
crossed the
politicians.
Rubicon now.
I don't despise, but I'm suspicious of politicians. Politics is what makes the world go round.
No, I agree. My worry about all of this, though, is that, again, it's about the egos of individuals. Trump wants to be seen to do a deal. My worry is there may be a deal to be done, but actually the very fact that he's talked publicly about the fact that there could be a deal to be done, I think might empower Putin to just keep pressing.
Yeah.
It marginalises Zelensky, and the question is that it may be that part of that deal is that Zelensky has to give up a load of land, but doesn't actually have a say in the conversation.
The future.
And that I think is, I mean,
Quite possible.
I'm sure there's lots of people going to be watching this criticising that, but it's just a possible outcome. You can start to see things lining up that way, and that would be, in my humble opinion, it would reward Putin for his aggression. It would embolden him for the future, and goodness knows what message that China would take when it looks at Taiwan through that lens.